Well, let's go to some of the stuff that you really track, and specifically in terms of creating a database for hormone therapy clinics that actually practice gender affirming care, which is hormone therapy is part of that, and that do something called informed consent. Why? Maybe we're skipping a few steps, but why is informed consent so important for trans people or non-binary people when it comes to seeking affirming care?
So informed consent is extremely important. For me, it made the difference as to whether or not I was going to transition, I think. I had a fairly typical like transgender experience as a kid in terms of like in the 90s, I grew up. I had a fairly solid idea of what my gender identity was. I repressed it because I was living in the South. And whenever I had originally learned about being transgender, I discovered that at the time in the 90s, you had to go through something called real life experience, which means that before you're even allowed to start hormone therapy or anything like that, you basically have to dress as your gender and present as your gender out in public for like 2 years. That has become very much not in practice in the last 10 years or so because of the fact that that would often single transgender people out for much abuse and targeting and violence because, you know, the transgender person had no ability to change their appearance, their hormonal profile, and often it would very much cause a lot of trouble for that person. So the reason I mention this is because I had held off on my own transition because that seemed like a terrifying prospect. And it wasn't until I turned around 30 years old, which was 3 years ago for me, so I'm dating myself here, that I learned that informed consent was now a major way that they did things. And so informed consent, what informed consent is you go to a doctor, you let them know your gender identity, you let them know that you're transgender. They'll give a very basic psychological test / battery that essentially covers, you know, are there other things going on in your life that we need to be aware of while we're treating you? But it's not meant to be a gatekeeping process. And they, as you are a consenting adult, they let you know the risks and benefits and the studies. You sign off on it, and they'll track your hormonal profile. They will treat you. They will give you your gender affirming care. What's so important about this is that if it's not for informed consent, you often have to go through thousands of dollars in therapy sessions, and you have to go through many gatekeeping processes. You have to go to endocrinologists. And given the state of healthcare in the United States, that's very difficult for a lot of people, especially people in poverty or people that are students or people that don't know how to navigate the medical system. And so informed consent bypasses all of that and allows a transgender person to transition at their own pace, guided by medical professionals.
Right. And that's huge, because otherwise it's left up to some, I'm just understanding this myself, like some sort of entity or body called, is it the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, that decides whether or not you should or can or deserve hormone therapy because you are or are not like trans enough, so to speak?
Yes. WPATH, yes, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And, you know, WPATH has been in some ways good for transgender rights and acceptance, but also in some ways regressive. And so it wasn't until very recently that WPATH started allowing for informed consent. I know that their newest guidelines that they're putting out does explicitly allow for informed consent hormone therapy treatment. But yes, it is the gatekeeping organization, and there are still doctors that are several standards of care behind in terms of following the WPATH recommendations. And in fact, most states in the United States are way behind in terms of coverage of medical care for transgender people. So for instance, things like hormone therapy, gender reassignment surgery are all that most insurances cover. But now in the standards of care now, they should be covering things like voice therapy or hair removal or masculinization and facial feminization surgery, various kinds of surgeries that a few standards of care ago they didn't cover, but now they do.
Mm-hmm. As someone who pays out of pocket for Obamacare, I'm like, I want all of it. Like,
exactly.
I'd be like, give me these premiums. Are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to get everything.
Exactly. I want the Cadillac.
Exactly. No. And of course, all that is if you do have access to healthcare or can afford it. Let's fucking do away with access if you can afford it. But so you're saying essentially that with informed consent, you go in, you can speak to a medical professional, and they're not going to immediately sort of raise an eyebrow or ask you, a myriad of questions, or say, well, come back, almost like the way abortion is criminalized. Come back in 2 years and tell me how you're feeling, and then we'll discuss.
And there are very much people that go through that process if it were not for informed consent. The amount of stories that I hear on Twitter, people messaging me, transgender people that had gone to a therapist for 3 years before they realized that their therapist was simply gaslighting them and holding back their ability to transition.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.